Hey guys, welcome to today's video. It is on populations. The purpose of today's lesson is to look at growth rates when analyzing data. We will also look into K and R selection. They are two types of reproductive strategies. Firstly, distribution and abundance. You can find this in 5.1. So an organism is either a unicellular or multicellular thing. And when we were looking at the number of one type of organisms or species in a particular area at a particular time, that is called their population. The distribution, however, is the regions in which a species is found. So the distribution of the common plains African zebra is East and South Africa. Whereas abundance is the number of a species in a specific area at any time. So we could talk about the abundance of zebras in all of Africa or just in Tanzania. Population density, though, is the number of a particular population living in an area at a time per unit area. So if we saw this image here, we can see, well, there's a lot of penguins living in this area, so they must have a high population density. And interestingly, in cold weather, they can fit up to 19 birds in 1 meter square when huddling. The way in which populations distribute themselves varies. We have random distribution, and that's an unpredictable spacing of individuals. An example of this could be when seeds are blown across a field. The benefit is that there's less competition over space and over resources, similarly as seen in evenly spaced distribution. Like in the penguin example, more or less there is equal spaces between each one. And again, that just lessens competition. But more commonly seen in nature is clumping. And this is where individuals form clusters and groups. And this provides protection as well as benefits the species when hunting for feeding. Population growth from 5.2. So this is an image of the number of people living in a particular area per square kilometer across the world. And we can see that from this image, areas like Asia, India, and Europe, and America have a higher population density as opposed to, say, Australia or New Zealand. If we zoomed in on Australia and just talked about Queensland, Queensland is the third most populous state in Australia with a total of about 5 million people. The population density, though, is about 3 people per square kilometer. If we looked at Italy, though, has a much higher population density with about 206 people per square kilometer. The people who study densities and populations are called demographers or demographers. Here's another interesting graph and map, and it's showing us the number of cases of people infected with COVID-19 across the world as of mid-April. And we can see that areas such as Europe and Asia, again, they have a higher number of cases as opposed to Australia and New Zealand. So we can see that population density has something to do with transmission. But we can also see that there's other factors at play too, such as in America here. It's extremely prevalent, and that's because of regulations and restrictions and other things, right? An article came out from a university in Sweden recently, and it estimated that the population density aboard the cruise ship, the Ruby Princess, was about 4 times higher of that in Wuhan. So again, we can see why it spread so quickly there. Let's talk about population growth as opposed to growth rate. And I'll pull up this graph. It shows us that population growth is the increase in the size of a population in a particular habitat over time. The species that we're talking about here is humans. And it's over the last 2,000 years, past, present, we have now, as well as into the future, up to about 2,100. We can see that there was this steady increase, followed by a rapid increase and then this kind of plateauing out, leveling effect. And that is because of limiting factors, which we will talk about shortly, as well as in next week's video. But population growth rate refers to the rate of change in a population over time. So we can see that there is a much steeper population growth rate here, but then it actually tapers off. If we zoomed in on our time, just the last 70 years on population growth rate, we would see something like this. So even though it's increasing, do you notice that over years, percent up the side here, rate, it's actually decreasing. So in about the 1960s, 70s, it reached its highest point, just above 2%, but now we're at about 1.05% per annum. So still increasing in population growth, but the rate at which we are increasing is decreasing. I'm going to show you the website that I got this information off now. So let's see if this works. So this is Somewhat Life, right? And it shows us the current world population is coming up to about 8 billion people. Shows the number of births today are much higher than the number of deaths. So overall, there is a population growth today of about 112,000 so far. And it is currently midday. If we scroll down, we have the top 20 largest countries by population, with China, India, and USA. Australia is not here. We come about 55th on the scale. And then there's the graph that I just showed you. So we can see that over the last 2,000 years, and in particular the last couple of centuries, there's a massive increase. I'm going to zoom in now. So if I take us back to the start, so this is about 2,000 years ago. From there we can see that population has steadily, at a linear rate, begun to rise. It's a bit steeper now. And then we're coming up to about the 1300s here. And what do you notice? In the 1300s, there is not only a plateauing effect, but a decrease in the population growth. Why do you think that was? What happened during that time? Was it a war? No, it was a sickness, hey. The Black Death swept through and actually wiped out about 50 million of the world population at the time. That was 60% of Europe's population, caused by a bacterium that traveled on the fleas on rats. So if we keep moving on, we can see that it's getting a lot steeper. We've just hit the industrial period, and now we're coming up to our point in time, 2000s, moving on into the future. By 2100, we can start to see this almost plateauing out, and that's because we reach what is called carrying capacity. We will talk about that more later as well, but it just means there's a limiting factors at play now. And then if I scroll down, we have the growth rate percent graph. So even though our population is still increasing, the rate at which it is decreasing. So let's jump back into the presentation. Limiting factors are conditions that limit the growth, abundance, or distribution of an organism or a population of organisms. So there's two different types. There's density independent, so that means irregardless of the density of that population, these factors can still have an effect, and we have things such as flood, or fire, or pesticides, temperature change, climate change, destruction of habitat, so perhaps climate change again, or if a meteorite came into the Earth or onto Australia. Irregardless of the density, there's going to be an impact on the population. And then lastly, drought. We will talk about density-dependent factors more next week. So we just looked at what happened in the 1300s. There's actually this tiny little bacterium called Yersinia pestis that had such a massive effect on the population growth. And we're seeing something not on the same scale, right, but similar at the moment with COVID-19. So moving on, we can calculate the growth rate in a population by using this formula. So although it's probably cut off there, it says R equals B plus I together, subtracted by together, D plus E. And what that stands for is R equals births plus immigrations, take deaths plus emigration. So the number coming in and then the numbers going out. Obviously, if the deaths are higher than the births, then the population growth rate would be decreasing, going negative. But if this side is greater than this side, then the population will be increasing. So if we have 6 that are born, 9 that fly in of this species, 4 die, and 2 leave, calculates the growth rate for this population at this point in time. So pause the video here, guys, and give that a shot. So if you just plugged in those values, you would have 6 plus 9 together minus 4 plus 2, which would have given you 9. So it's a growth rate of 9. However, was that over 1 week or 1 year? It doesn't matter. We're not given that information. Either way, there is an increase in populations. And although we will talk about this more next week, there's 2 different types of graphs that we can see when a population grows. There's an exponential growth, which is what we're seeing now in the human population. That's over time, the population is just increasing, what's called exponentially. But if we add more time to that, we will see this logistic growth curve. And it shows us that over time, that growth begins to slow down and plateau out because carrying capacity is reached. And that just means that the environment, the Earth, only has so much resource and ability to sustain growth until it just levels out. So population growth strategies. I'm going to introduce 2 terms. We have R strategis, and that's a species that occupies unstable environments. So it lives in environments that are constantly changing. And so to help them, they have a high growth rate. They grow really quickly. They also occupy less crowded areas, and they produce many offspring. We can also add to this list of characteristics that there is little parental care involved. They just produce heaps of offspring and let them go to help their species and population survive. Then we have K strategis, and this is a species whose population fluctuates at or nearing carrying capacity, represented by the letter K. So let's look at a few species. We have oysters down this end, closer to the R strategis end. They are very much an R strategy. They produce 500 million fertilized eggs a year and provide no parental care. Then we have great apes up this end. And they are an example of a very K strategy. They produce 1 infant every 5 or 6 years and provide extensive parental care. So R strategists could be mice and rats. They produce many offspring, provide little care, and many actually die off quickly. That's another trait. Then we have frogs. They produce many spawn. And elephants, which in their 70-year lifespan may only produce half a dozen young. And of course, humans would fit into this category too, wouldn't we? So here is a graph just showing this information in another way. We have type 1, type 2, type 3, different types of species. Let's look at the R strategists. They are more type 3. They produce many young at birth, but then many actually die off. There's low survivorship. The ones that do survive, survive well until they die. As opposed to humans, for example, type 1s, K strategists, where most survive birth, but then and then they grow old, and at the end of the life they die off. As opposed to species that can live in between. They can be plants or even different types of bacteria. So in the textbook you will read about biofilms, and they can change between R strategists and K strategists depending on the conditions. So let's look at a question together. This is taken from QCAA. And I did not just show you how to do this, however. Let's look at it now. So the question is, in 1978, a population of migratory shorebird was estimated at 90,000 individuals, but over time, that population is now 50,000. So calculate the change in population growth for this species. Guys, you can either pause the video here, give it a shot, or hang on a second and I'll give you a clue to help you. So, for that help, here is the formula to be able to calculate percentage change. The final, take the initial over the initial times by 100. So pause the video here and plug those values in. Okay, if you did that, you'll get something like this. Well, 50,000, that was the final. Take 90,000, the initial, divided by 90,000 times 100. That was a decrease, so that's why it's negative, by 44%. So the answer is B. Again, study these skills. So another question. The black-browed albatross, so that's this, you can see the dark brows there, is a wide-ranging, large seabird that forages, meaning it looks extensively for food, far offshore and returns to communal breeding sites. Which limiting factor is likely to have the greatest negative impact on the carrying capacity of this species? So we have not talked directly about this, but you can put information together to come up with an answer. So you can pause the video here and give it a shot yourselves firstly. Okay, let's talk through it. So if we have this bird that goes far and wide to get food and then comes back to breed, it's going to be one of those two factors that if either one of those was impacted, it would likely have a big effect on that species population, on the number. So we can pretty much count out presence of parasites and natural predation. The answer is food supply, because, well, that's where the birds go to get food. If they can't get food, they can't come back and they can't mate. So that is the answer. That is all for the questions attached to this video, but I would suggest that you guys begin Chapter 5 review questions in your textbook, because next week there's a few more questions attached to the video that I'll get you guys to work on. And that is all for today. So I will leave you with these cute gifs of baby elephants. They are notoriously clumsy, but I think extremely cute at the same time. So guys, God bless you. I hope that this video was very informative, and I will see you shortly.